Are you responsible for the death of Annette Smith?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Tell me what's happened.
Why did you go to those lengths to do that?
To dispose of the body?
Yeah.
Because I thought if there wasn't a body, I'd get away with it.
In 1994, Annette Smith married Mr. Smith, who already had a son of his own. At the time that Annette entered Mr. Smith and his son's lives, his son was 5 years old. They lived together in a 2-bedroom flat of West Wing Fairfield Hall in Stotfold, Bedfordshire. And this place just looks absolutely incredible. It's a former asylum, and it had been converted into a number of flats. But after 11 years of marriage, in 2005, Annette and Mr. Smith separated. It was Mr. Smith that moved out and left Annette with the home. She stayed. Now, I'm not sure what the original ownership agreement was, but after Mr. Smith had moved out, he remained 20% ownership of the flat. Annette owned 80% all to herself. And for the record, despite this story lasting a lot longer than 2005, Annette and her husband never got divorced. They stayed married throughout. And now we're talking 20 years nearly that they'd been separated and stayed married. It should come as no surprise that Annette stayed in contact with her stepson. I mean, she'd been a big part of most of his life. And he described her as a very kind and caring person who was always there for me throughout the years. But before we get any further into this case, we need to do my usual disclaimer. This is a true crime case. It's a real story involving real people. Them real people have real families and real friends. So although I do want you to share it, and I do want you to comment, please do be sensitive as you do so. So it was about 2005 that they'd separated. And it was 3 or 4 years later, in roughly 2009, 2010, that Annette, who's now about 59-year-old, were in this bar and restaurant. And she met 29-year-old Scott Paterson. He was working in this bar restaurant, and although it were one of them kind of relationships, customer and worker, it did eventually, over the years, become an actual friendship. It had been 3 years that they'd been talking, and this friendship really did start to blossom. But it were about 3 years' time, in 2012, that Scott and his partner separated. And that left Scott with nowhere to go, nowhere to live. And of course, while he's at work, Annette's there, and he's telling her about his troubles, saying that he's not fully homeless, but he pretty much is. He ain't got anywhere to stay because he's split up with his partner. And Annette's kind of like, look, I know you, I like you, I enjoy your company, I enjoy spending time with you. I've got a spare room. Why don't you come and use that until you find somewhere else to live? But that is exactly what it were. It were a temporary idea, an helpful gesture to give him somewhere to stay while he got his fingers together, while he got himself sorted and sorted himself out a permanent solution. Annette didn't want any board money off him, no rent money. She wanted nothing in exchange for him staying there. Obviously, she got the odd perk. She had a companion, which she hadn't had for years. She wouldn't be at home, all alone. And the other perks that came with that, like sharing the chores and things like that. But there were no real conditions. It was just a temporary, come and stay with me until you get yourself sorted. But then months passed, and Scott still hadn't moved out. In fact, years passed, and Scott still hadn't moved out. And there were no sign of him moving out. And although that might sound very typical, the typical vulture that the freeloader just moves in and constantly tries to stay as long as possible to get the easy life, that weren't really the case here. You see, Scott and Annette's relationship had blossomed. They'd become really great friends. They went on holidays together. They went to the theatre together. They had regular dinner parties at home. Annette Smith was always immaculately turned out. She was the life and soul of any and every party. And it is reported that Annette's husband became concerned that having Scott Paterson there wasn't a good thing for her, and that the house was not being looked after properly. And honestly, I think that's quite fair. If I were talking to someone in the pub and they were like, yeah, I've got this guy that's 30 years younger than me, living with me for rent-free, we've become really good friends, it's all good, I'd be like, are you sure he's not taking advantage of you? And obviously we try not to judge, but that is the immediate thing that comes across. You know what I mean? You'd be like, be careful. There's just something that seems out of the ordinary about this. Probably because it is out of the ordinary. Especially if I'm my estranged wife or another relative. I believe in 2013, Scott opened up a restaurant and bar with a business partner. Scott was entitled the co-owner and restaurant manager. Another 5 years on from that, it's now 2018. 6 years since Scott moved in temporarily for a couple of weeks. Yes, 6 years. And he is still living with Annette, and he's still not paying rent. But for all intents and purposes, things were still going well. 39-year-old Scott Paterson had been running errands for 69-year-old Annette, and their friendship were absolutely as strong as ever. But it was in 2018 that Annette suffered a stroke. The stroke had took its toll on Annette, and it had significantly impacted her mobility. And at this time, Scott rightfully stepped up. He were acting in part as a carer, helping her with daily tasks. And I'm not sure if this is the reason why, but on the 4th of December 2018, Scott sold his share in the restaurant. Then we all know what happened just over a year later. That big thing that impacted the entire world in 2020. That alone took a toll on a lot of people, but Annette was definitely one of them. She's now 71, and let's not forget, she's a woman that used to enjoy holidays and being the life and soul at dinner parties. But now she's locked down, she's got impaired mobility from a stroke. It must have been absolutely awful for Annette. In just a few short years, her life had changed drastically, and then even more drastically. Her mobility declined more and more, and she was now suffering with depression. The stroke left her with a weak arm, to the extent that she needed help to wash. And again, Scott would quite often provide help, even in that area. He was there to help whenever needed, like collecting prescriptions and doing shopping, the general things, and he'd also help wash her if needed. Annette's health got to that much of a bad state that there's evidence that she got to a point where she could barely even walk without assistance. She was effectively bedbound. That global phase that we all went through passed, but the hard times didn't. In early 2023, Mr. Smith told Annette that he could no longer afford to keep his share of the flat. He needed to liquidate his 20%, because the fallout of the virus response, it affected business. He couldn't afford it anymore. He needed the money back to keep his business alive. He needed to sell his 20%. Annette didn't want to sell, but I don't think she could afford the 20% either. And I can't blame her for not wanting to sell, because this, as I said earlier, this place is absolutely beautiful. If you watch it on YouTube, there should be pictures up now. It is a phenomenal building. And obviously she doesn't own the entire building. She's just got a flat. I mean, the thing looks like a castle. But it weren't just because she didn't want to sell it. She didn't want to leave. That were her home. And had been for years. But at this point as well, she's kind of, I'm old, I'm frail, I don't want to move out, but I am too young to be in a residential care home. However, and apparently, Scott felt pressured to encourage her to sell up. So he did, and she agreed. The property ended up going into the hands of the estate agents. And by this point, although Scott's been taking care of Annette, he's also completed a butchery course, and he's got himself a job at a local farm shop on the deli and butcher counter. And don't forget, at this point it's 2023, so Annette's about 74 and Scott's about 44. And it in Scott's opinion, since Annette's stroke in 2018, her care demands were getting worse. They were pushing Scott to breaking point. And just to clarify, that's Scott's opinion. Don't give me all the crap about, oh, breaking point. It's Scott that said that, not me. But it weren't just Annette's needs that were putting pressure on Scott, because it was actually in £30,000 worth of credit card debt. And it's at this time that he's so desperate for money, he's actually started stealing from Annette. Most of the things he stole were jewellery, but there were other valuable things as well, like a gold sovereign coin. Once he'd stolen this stuff, he'd take it to his local cash for gold shop. By the start of November 2023, Scott was drinking wine every single day. And for a couple of weeks, he'd actually been thinking about killing Annette. But he weren't just thinking about it. He were like properly contemplating it. At least on 2 occasions, he'd gone to her bedroom door while she was sleeping, with all the intentions of killing her. But then, looking at her laid in bed, he realised what he was doing and changed his mind. Unfortunately, on the night of Wednesday, the 8th of November, 2023, things were very different. That night, Scott waited in his room until Annette had fell asleep. And he knew when she'd fell asleep because she was a loud snorer. Once the snoring had given him the signal, he crept into her bedroom, grabbed a pillow, and held it over her face. Scott Paterson suffocated Annette Smith. He held the pillow over her face for a few minutes, and then once she was dead, he just left her there. He went back into his own room and drank a bottle of wine. Then the next day, he went back into her bedroom. He rolled her up in a large green blanket, pulled her into the bathroom, and then he left her there again. And then almost a week had passed. But there was an issue. On Tuesday the 14th of November, there was an appointment for a photographer to come to take pictures of the flat for the estate agents. But Annette's body were in the bathroom, and it had been there for nearly a week. But that weren't too much of an issue. It could move her. But you wonder, where's he going to move her to? It's already been there for a week. Surely he should have got rid of it by now. Scott put in the cupboard under the stairs. I mean, let's bear in mind here, when the photographer came to take pictures of the house, Annette had already been dead for 6 nights, or 5 days. But if you think that's bad, and if you're trying to imagine the smell, he actually left her in the flat for several more weeks. It weren't until early January that he moved her body into the hallway. And it's reported for all these several weeks that Annette's been dead, he continued to talk to her about everyday things like normal. And on a number of occasions, he'd look at himself in the mirror and say, I killed someone. Now, if you're anything like me, you'd be thinking, why is he put her in the hallway? That weren't where he was going to leave her next. But while she was in the hallway, he took to her with a knife from the kitchen and removed her feet. Over the next couple of weeks, he used the knife and he also utilised a saw to continue removing other parts of her body. These included both legs, both forearms, and her head. He wrapped each different body part in plastic and disposed of them gradually at different times in different locations. But obviously the torso is quite a big part of the body, and he did try to dismember that, but it was too difficult, so he left it intact. But eventually, like everything else, he wrapped the torso in plastic. He then put it into a suitcase and wrapped that in a tarpaulin. He then took it to a storage unit that he was renting out in Letchworth and left it there with some of his belongings. And of course, I know what you're thinking, at this point months have passed. She's got family and friends. Why hasn't anybody noticed her absence? But they have. On many occasions, her friends and family and neighbours are asking Scott where Annette is. And of course he just lied to them. He made up this elaborate story of going on a trip with this mystery female. This friend that, despite their long-time friendship, he had no idea who this friend were. He'd never seen her before. Not only that, bearing in mind it's her flat that he's living there for free, Annette's just, right, this woman that you don't know, I'm going away with her, I'm not going to tell you where, not going to tell you how long for, or who she is, bye. And it didn't stop there though. It'd even gone to the extent of logging into a laptop, accessing an email, and sending emails to her loved ones. He also went on Moonpig and bought cards and sent that to the loved ones. He was doing his best to portray that she were alive and well, she'd just gone somewhere. Another extent he went to was to order cuddly toys, offline to be delivered to Annette's stepson's daughters, Annette's granddaughters, in December, making the appearance that they were Christmas presents from Annette. But they said you should keep your lies simple. Impersonating someone to this extent, to people that really, really know her, isn't easy. It takes a lot of attention to detail, and it's very time consuming. And Scott had made a fatal mistake. The emails that he was sending to Annette's husband and stepson had kisses on the end. And that rang up not true. They noticed that and thought it were a bit unusual. Something weren't right about these emails. So him and his new partner became so concerned about Annette that on Wednesday, the 10th of January 2024, exactly 9 weeks since Annette's murder, Mr. Smith contacted Bedfordshire Police and reported his estranged wife missing. Now, of course, the police looked into it. Of course they did. They went straight round to her house, knocked on the door, and Scott answered. So he said, "Where's Annette?" And he told them the same lie that he'd told everyone else. So the police said, "Oh." And they deemed that there weren't enough evidence to deem that Annette were actually missing. But that didn't quite sit well with Mr. Smith. He knew something weren't right. This just all seems a bit too strange. So he decided he was going to take it upon himself to find out what's happened to Annette. He decided to hire a private investigator. But as you can imagine, they couldn't find anything. They were completely unsuccessful at tracing Annette. And I have to say, I think that's absolutely incredible of Mr. Smith. It was only 12 months ago that he needed to sell the flat because he ain't got enough money to sustain his lifestyle. But here he is spending his money on a private investigator to try and find Annette. Most people would have just took the police's word for it or not known what to do after. But here he is, and here's his partner forking out for a private investigator going, "There's something definitely not right, we need to find out what it is." And I just think that's so loyal and caring, and it's just admirable, you know? With a private investigator not being able to trace Annette, it went quite cold. What are you supposed to do in that circumstance? The police aren't interested, they said there's no evidence, and I'm not quite sure if the private investigator found anything. But on the 8th of April, Mr. Smith phoned Bedfordshire Police once again and reported Annette missing. But this time weren't like the last time. This time, he told the police that he'd found Annette's passport, a mobile phone, and other personal belongings, including a laptop, inside the flat. Now, the police couldn't pass it off, so they launched a high-risk missing persons investigation. The 8th of April, by the way, is 22 weeks since Annette's murder. As the month went on, the appeal for information started hitting the news. The narrative was that Annette had vanished 5 months earlier and had last been seen on or around the 11th of November 2023. She was 74 and last seen wearing a black and white striped cardigan and red leather slip-on shoes. She was carrying a suitcase and is thought to have got into a navy blue or black estate car with another woman. However, like the private investigator, the police couldn't find anything at all. There had been no activity on Annette's bank accounts. Nobody had actually seen or heard from her directly. Pretty much all of the belongings were still at home. The Moonpig cards that people had been receiving off her didn't quite seem like she'd written, and the emails didn't seem like they were from her either. And then the police discovered CCTV at Cash for Gold. Of course, this CCTV was of Scott selling Annette's jewellery before and after a disappearance. So on Friday, the 19th of April, 2024, 5 days after the missing persons appeal were launched, the missing persons investigation officially turned into a murder investigation. And it was just over a week later, at 7 minutes to 7, on the morning of Tuesday the 30th of April, 2024, Scott Paterson was arrested on suspicion of murder. And at that point, it didn't seem like Scott was at all surprised by his arrest. He appeared totally calm throughout, and when he was cautioned, he made no comment at all. Inside the flat, the police found Annette's bank card and wallet, and they also found some correspondence in her name. Back at the station, Scott was interviewed at 10 a.m. And very strangely for the cases I've covered, Scott just outright confessed. Right at the start of the interview, just 6 minutes after the recording had started, the interviewing officer asked Scott, "Are you responsible for the death of Mrs. Smith?" And Scott then just said, "Yeah." He then went on to give the police a full account leading up to the murder, or at least his account of what happened before the murder itself, and the aftermath, including the dismemberment of the body and the concealment of it. I have got some footage from the police interview, so I'll put that up now.
Are you responsible for the death of Annette Smith?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Tell me what's happened.
I suffocated her in her bed with a pillow.
Okay. When was this?
The 8th of November.
Tell me in as much detail as you can
hmm
what happened that day. So start wherever you need to start, but I need as much detail as you can give me. Take your time.
Well, it happened in the evening, at night, after Annette had fallen asleep. And yeah, I put a pillow over her face until she stopped breathing, and I left her in bed for the night.
What was going through your mind that day?
I just wanted to get out of the situation. And as I say, in hindsight, there are obviously better ways to have done that, but it just felt I don't know, just felt when I sort of snapped, I suppose, it just felt like what I should do.
And at what point did you decide to do that? You said it's been a build-up.
Yeah, I think I had thought about it for a little while beforehand.
Mm-hmm. When you say a little while, what does that mean to you?
Maybe a few weeks.
Okay.
Is that what you had been thinking for a few weeks?
Yeah.
Or were you thinking of other ways as well?
No, that was what I was thinking.
When you were suffocating her, did you at any point think to stop?
I did for a split second, because I realised what I was doing was wrong. But then I kind of thought, I wasn't sure. I don't know, I just decided to carry on.
Why did you go to those lengths to do that?
To dispose of the body?
Yeah.
Because I thought if there wasn't a body, I'd get away with it.
In this interview, he confessed that he'd been thinking about killing Annette for some time, and on at least 2 occasions he went to do it, but he backed down. One of the many things that Scott confessed to in this police interview was that he'd entered into an individual voluntary agreement with his creditors because he'd ran up the £30,000 worth of credit card debt. And he went on to admit in the run-up to Annette's murder, he'd been stealing jewellery out of the bedroom while she was asleep. He admitted that he'd done that for the sole purpose of selling it for cash, and he continued to do it after he'd killed her. It said that in total, he'd received about £5,000 for the things that he'd stolen off her. At first, he told the police, look, I was stealing these things because I was really annoyed at the fact that I was constantly buying the shopping, like the cigarettes and the brandy, and it weren't fair. So I stole these things to get the money back. However, he did later correct that lie by admitting that he stole the stuff just because he needed and wanted the money. When asked where Annette is now, he paused for a moment, and then with a cold, hard face, he said, there isn't a full body, and she's in a storage unit. What remains of her is in a storage unit in Letchworth. And you know, it's totally messed up, but I have got a little bit of respect for Scott. Not for him as a person or anything like that, but usually in these cases there's a twist. They claim diminished responsibility and all these magic things that they think's going to get them away with. But Scott didn't. There is absolutely no twist here. Obviously he tried to get away with the murder. He hid the body. He lied to everybody. And I'm not saying, don't take it that I respect him. But he has just gone, yep, you caught me. I tried to get away with it and I failed. As you probably heard him in interview, when we said, well, why did you do that with the body? He said, because I thought I'd get away with it. If there were no body, I won't get done. And I don't know, I think it's just because I'm surprised that he's not trying to get away with it in regards to the legal process. It is so strange. And in a fucked up way, it's quite honourable. Sorry, but it is. And let's not forget, by the way, he knew it were a murder investigation. It were on the news that it were a murder investigation. He could have quite easily just fled. And he didn't. Even at the pre-trial preparation hearing at Luton Crown Court on the 9th of September 2024, he just simply pled guilty. And again, I think because of him saying he snapped under the pressure and stuff, I really did think this were going down a diminished responsibility route. But no, Scott's just guilty. That's Scott. And I know I'm rambling here, but you really need to get this right. I don't respect him. He's a 44-year-old guy living with somebody that's 30 years older than him, rent-free. He's racked up £30,000 of a credit card debt despite the fact that he's living rent-free. I have no respect for him as a person. I have no respect for what he's done to a very vulnerable person. But most of these scumbags try and drag it out, pull the family through the trial. Scott hasn't done that, and that's the part I respect. Although you can argue that actually he's only pleading guilty to get a lighter sentence, it just makes a change. But before I dig myself a deep hole, we're going to get straight onto it. There's no trial because he's pled guilty straight away. So the judge at the Luton Crown Court found the starting point for Scott's mandatory life sentence to be the minimum of 15 years. Then there's the aggravating and mitigating factors. For aggravation, there was the significant premeditation. He premeditated it, he'd thought about it for a while, he kept trying to do it and bailing out, and he eventually did it. It was definitely premeditated. Annette was vulnerable by nature of her age, her actual health, and the fact that Scott was supposed to be her carer, I don't think that were official. But that also makes her vulnerable as well because she would have trusted him. And she was asleep. The concealment, dismemberment and destruction of Annette Smith's body. The fact that he'd been stealing things from her before and after her death. And the last aggravating factor was the emails, the cards and the presents. That's a double-edged aggravation because it's one, trying to get away with murder, and two, it is causing further pain to the family. There weren't much in the way of mitigation. There was, of course, his guilty plea, his previous good character, and the fact that he'd shown remorse. That put the minimum term up to 24 years. However, he got a full 1/6 off for his guilty plea. That is the most you can get off for your guilty plea, 1/6. So for the murder of vulnerable Annette Smith, Scott Paterson was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years less for 187 days that he'd spent in custody. As he was sentenced to life in prison, Scott stood, bowed his head and closed his eyes before leaving the dock. Unfortunately, due to how little this case has been reported, I haven't got full impact statements, but I have got bits, so here they are. Annette's stepson described Annette as a very kind and caring person who was always there for me throughout the years. He told the court that he'd initially believed Scott was a gentle giant. He was a nice guy, but in reality, he was an evil man. Annette was very vulnerable due to her mobility issues. I considered Annette as my mother, and I love her dearly. She was one of the kindest and most caring people. I can't understand why anyone would want to harm her. I have to try very hard not to think about what he did to her. He seemed like a nice, friendly guy, but he was a murderer. I will never forgive him for what he did. I hate him from the bottom of my heart. A tribute put together by Annette's family read, "We are totally heartbroken and devastated that Annette has been taken away from us in such a cruel and senseless way. She was a beautiful, caring, trusting and generous lady who meant so much to so many people. Annette, rest in peace with those who will love and take care of you." A cousin of Annette said, "She brought so much joy into our family, and we will love and miss you so much. Paterson took her away from us in such a cruel way. We go through pain every single day, endlessly, worrying about what she went through. And that's all I've got for you. I hope it's come out alright. I am quite tired and I could feel myself slurring a little bit as I was talking. So this video's took a lot longer than it should have to make. It's an hard one, isn't it? They'd been friends for a long time. And I do have to... The bit of Scott owning a bar restaurant, that is a bit of information that is nowhere else. If someone else reports that, it's because they got it from my video. I guarantee you. I use 74 sources on this. 72, sorry. I used 72 sources on this case, and it were only accidentally at the last minute that I'd clicked on that's the same Scott Paterson. There's a small chance it's not, and I'm going to get prosecuted, but I'm 100% sure it is. Same person, same name, same age, same location to live in, little village, pretty much same age, and I even ran it through a face software that I use, and it brought up that it was the same person. Although it looks very different when I was younger, I spent a lot of time looking at that, and I am confident that it's the same person. If it's not, I'm really sorry. But it is. If it's not, you'll know it's not, because I'll have to redact it, delete this video, and upload this video again. Scott's reason for murdering Annette is that there was too much pressure to look after her. Now, I know it can be stressful looking after somebody, but Annette had looked after him for so long. She'd let him live in her house for free for all that time. And I'm not saying that makes it easier. If you haven't got the patience to look after somebody, don't. Just simply don't. Just say, look, you need care. It could have contacted Mr. Smith and said, look, Mr. Smith, I need to move out. She needs care. Sorry, I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm moving out. Worst case scenario, she'll have to go into a home, which is what was probably going to happen anyway with them selling the house. It's just a heartbreaking, horrible case. And again, another senseless murder that didn't need to happen. Not saying any murder needs to happen, but this really were just without reason. It's ridiculous. Right, I'm going to quit because I've just rambled on for ages. I am really tired, so I'm going. But before I do, I should be talking about the Patreon and membership tiers, because there is new tiers, but I don't want to talk about that. What I do want to talk about, though, is the new merch I've just dropped. We've done limited edition merch before, which I've printed myself. Can't do that because I ain't got time. But I have done a completely new design for the pre-25k squad. So this merch will only be available until we hit 25k. The very second we hit 25k, gone, done, no more. And in the last 28 days, we have made about 4,000 subscribers. As I'm recording this right now, we're on 22,000 subscribers. I imagine it'll slow down for the next 3,000. I don't think we're going to do it in the next 20 days. But it just shows you how fast it can go if the right video's out there. So if you do want to get your hands on the 25k merch, please don't put it off too late, because I've said it, so now I've said it, that's it, it's done. As soon as we get to 25k, that will be removed from the site, never to be sold again. So there you go. Check out my Patreon membership too. All I'm saying is I love you, take care of yourself, take care of those around you, and I'll see you real soon. End of the month, I'll see you end of the month. Last Sunday of the month, be there. Stop rambling, bye!